Daughter-in-law Evelyn was whispering my medical power of attorney into her phone while I lay paralyzed by a vitamin she'd hand-delivered. Realizing my own family was the predator stalking my $5 million ranch. The smell of burnt cedar from the fireplace clung to the curtains, mixing with the sharp, clinical scent of the lavender oil Evelyn insisted on rubbing into my temples every evening. I sat in my wingback chair, my fingers tracing the deep, scarred grooves in the mahogany armrest, the same wood I had polished for 40 years. Outside, the Montana wind howled across the Silver Creek, a low, mourning sound that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the house. My legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, a terrifying contrast to the mind that was still sharp enough to catch the shift in the air. For weeks, I had sensed a shadow moving behind the smiles. I had begun to suspect a nursing home plot for $5 million ranch brewing in the quiet corners of the kitchen, hidden beneath the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of the dishwasher. Evelyn didn't scream or glare, she was the picture of devoted patience. She moved through my home with a terrifying, calm efficiency, already rearranging the heirlooms in her mind. "Are you feeling tired again, Arthur?" she asked, her voice a cool silk ribbon. She didn't wait for an answer as she adjusted the wool blanket over my knees, her touch light but possessive. I looked into her eyes, clear, blue, and utterly devoid of malice, and felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air. She wasn't a villain in her own story, she was a manager, simply optimizing an asset that happened to still be breathing. The mahogany armrest under my palm was more than wood, it was a chronicle of 40 years of labor. My thumb traced a deep, jagged nick near the front, the mark left by my wedding ring the day I hauled the first calving gate into place in the winter of '84. Back then, the wood was vibrant, smelling of forest and sap. Now, it smelled of the expensive, sterile lemon wax Evelyn used to cleanse my study, a scent that tried to scrub away the history of the room. This was the first sensory betrayal, the replacement of my life's scent with the smell of a hotel lobby. I tried to shift my weight, but my thighs felt like they were filled with wet sand. It was a peculiar, localized heaviness that had started shortly after Evelyn moved in to help after my minor dizzy spell in the spring. I looked at the glass of water on the side table. The water was clear, but the sunlight hitting it cast a refracted, oily shimmer on the surface. I remembered the taste of the well water from the north pasture, metallic, cold, and life-giving. This water, filtered and purified by the new system Evelyn insisted on installing, tasted flat. It tasted like nothing at all. It was the taste of a man losing his grip on his own land. "Arthur, you're staring again." Evelyn's voice drifted in from the doorway, as light as a falling leaf. She didn't enter the room with the heavy boots of a conqueror. She wore soft-soled slippers that muffled her footsteps, making her appear as if she were a ghost haunting my living hours. She carried a small, silver tray. On it sat a single white porcelain cup and a small, translucent blue pill. "The doctor said your circulation needs help. Remember?" she murmured, leaning over me. As she bent down, the scent of her perfume, a sharp, artificial lily, invaded my space. It was a scent that didn't belong on a ranch, it belonged in a high-rise office or a courtroom. I looked past her, through the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the $5 million ranch. The Silver Creek was shimmering under the late afternoon sun, the water moving like liquid mercury between the banks of willow trees. That land was the only thing keeping my heart beating, yet I felt the ownership of it slipping through my numb fingers every time I swallowed what she gave me. I took the pill. I had to. To refuse was to admit I suspected her, and I wasn't ready to show my cards yet. As the pill slid down my throat, I felt a faint, bitter aftertaste, not the bitterness of medicine, but something chemical, like the scorched smell of an old battery. 10 minutes later, the shift began. It wasn't a sudden blackout, it was a slow, agonizing thinning of reality. The vibrant greens of the pasture outside began to bleed into a dull gray. The sharp edges of the window frame became soft and blurred. I realized then that my dementia, the one Evelyn whispered about to the neighbors, wasn't coming from my brain. It was coming from the silver tray. The power balance in the room tilted. I was the owner of $5 million worth of prime Montana soil. But I couldn't even command my own eyelids to stay open. Evelyn stood by the window, her back to me. She wasn't looking at the beauty of the sunset, she was holding her phone. Her thumb scrolling rapidly. "Yes, the appraisal is done," she said into the phone, her voice barely a whisper. Yet in the silence of the room, it rang like a bell. "The nursing home has a vacancy starting Monday. We just need the signature on the medical proxy. He's transitioning. It's for the best. The ranch is too much for a man in his condition." Condition. She had created the condition. And now she was using it as the justification for the cure. My heart hammered against my ribs. A trapped bird in a cage of lead. I looked at the dust motes dancing in a shaft of dying light. They were free to float, to go where the air took them. I was anchored to a chair in a house that was being sold out from under me. I didn't feel anger yet. Anger requires energy, and the blue pill was stealing mine. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I watched the way the light died on the hills, turning the gold to purple, then to black. The ranch was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic thud of a fence post being driven in somewhere far off, or perhaps it was just the sound of my own pulse. Counting down the hours until I was no longer a person, but a problem to be solved. The shadows in the study lengthened, stretching across the floorboards like skeletal fingers reaching for the hearth. I kept my breathing rhythmic and shallow, mimicking the heavy, labored respiration of a man surrendered to sedation. Behind my closed eyelids, my mind was a frantic machine, stripping away the artificial haze to focus on the sound of Evelyn's voice. She had moved away from the window, the soft scuff of her slippers approaching my desk, my sanctuary, where the deeds to the $5 million ranch were kept in a locked brass-bound humidor. "He's stable for now, Mark," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum as she answered a return call. "But the episodes are becoming more frequent. He wandered toward the creek today. I found him just staring at the water. It's not safe anymore." A lie. A clean, clinical lie. I hadn't been to the creek in 3 days because my legs wouldn't carry me past the porch. But Mark, my son, the boy I'd taught to cast a fly line in that very water, was listening to this on the other end of the line. I waited for him to protest, to demand a second opinion, to say, "Dad is tougher than that." Instead, there was only a muffled silence from the phone's speaker, followed by Evelyn's soft, triumphant sigh. "I've already spoken to the director at Pinecrest," she continued, her fingers drumming a restless beat on the mahogany desk. "They specialize in late-stage cognitive decline. If we don't move him by Monday, the room goes to someone on the waiting list. Mark, honey, we have to think about the estate. The taxes alone will bury us if we don't liquidate the back 40 before the end of the quarter." The back 40, that was the heart of the ranch. The portion with the old oak grove where my wife's ashes were scattered. To Evelyn, it was a liquid asset. To Mark, it was apparently a tax burden. The betrayal didn't sting like a sharp cut, it felt like a slow freezing. A numbing of the soul. Evelyn stopped talking. I heard the distinct click of the desk drawer being pried open, not with a key, but with something metallic and thin. She had been picking the lock. I heard the rustle of vellum paper, my original will. Then, the sound of a pen uncapping. For a horrifying moment, I thought she might forge my signature right then and there. But what I heard next was worse. It was the sound of a paper shredder, the small, portable one she'd brought into the house last week, whirring to life for exactly 3 seconds. Zip, zip, zip. My old will, the one that left everything to Mark with the condition that the land never be subdivided, was being turned into confetti. She wasn't just planning my relocation, she was erasing my intent. The shredder stopped. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Evelyn walked back to my chair. I felt her hand on my forehead, checking my temperature with the clinical detachment of a butcher inspecting a side of beef. Her skin was unnaturally cold. "Sleep well, Arthur," she whispered. "Tomorrow is a big day for all of us." I waited until I heard her bedroom door click shut at the end of the hall. I waited another hour, listening to the house groan as the temperature outside plummeted. The blue pill's grip was loosening, replaced by a surge of cold. Rascalivage, calculated, adrenaline. My legs still felt heavy. But the sand had turned to gravel. I could move them if I fought for it. I gripped the armrests and forced myself upward. My joints popped like dry kindling. I shambled toward the desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The drawer was closed, but not fully latched. I pulled it open. The humidor was gone. In its place was a sleek, black folder embossed with the logo of a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was the new document. The one she wanted me to sign. It wasn't just a medical proxy, it was a full transfer of development rights. But as I flipped through the pages with trembling fingers, something caught my eye, a sticky note tucked into the back. Handwritten in a hurried scrawl that wasn't Evelyn's. It was a list of names. Names of developers, and at the bottom, a single figure that made the $5 million valuation of the ranch look like pocket change. I looked at the clock. It was 2:14 a.m. In 6 hours, the car would arrive to take me to Pinecrest. In 6 hours, Arthur Miller would be transitioned into a room with no view. I looked at the black folder, then at the empty space where my life's work used to sit. I didn't cry, I didn't pray, I reached for the telephone landline, but the cord had been neatly snipped. I looked out the window at the moonlit ranch. The wind had died down, leaving the world in a terrifying, expectant stillness. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for the truth of who I was before they turned me into a ghost. Then, a soft light flickered in the distance, down by the old barn. A flashlight? Someone was out there, and they weren't supposed to be. The cold of the Montana night didn't just touch my skin, it bit through the fabric of my flannel pajamas like an old debt. As I eased the mudroom door open, the hinge gave a sharp, metallic cry, a sound that, in my prime, I would have silenced with a drop of oil months ago. Now, it sounded like a frantic warning. I stepped onto the porch, and the smell of wet sage and frozen earth rushed into my lungs. It was a sharp, astringent scent that sliced through the lingering haze of Evelyn's vitamin. It tasted like reality, harsh, unyielding, and honest. This was the scent of the land that didn't know how to lie. A stark contrast to the sterile lemon wax and artificial lilies inside. I didn't walk, I navigated the shadows. My boots, unlaced and heavy, felt like anchors. Every step toward the old barn was a gamble against my own fading equilibrium. The flashlight beam I had seen earlier flickered again near the tack room. My heart hammered against my ribs. Not with fear, but with a cold, predatory focus. If this was one of Evelyn's developers scouting the land early, they would find that the old lion still had teeth. When I reached the barn, the rhythmic, heavy thud of a horse shifting in its stall greeted me. It was a vibration I felt in the soles of my feet before I heard it, a grounding frequency that reminded me of the decades I'd spent here before Evelyn was even a whisper in my son's ear. I leaned against the rough-hewn cedar post, the splinters catching on my palm. The pain was a gift, it kept me tethered to the present. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice sounding like gravel grinding in a tin can. The flashlight beam snapped onto the floor, then vanished. A figure stepped out from the darkness behind the hay bales. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was a woman, her face obscured by a heavy Carhartt hood. But I recognized the way she stood, shoulders squared, feet planted wide. "Grandpa?" The word hit me harder than the cold. It was Sarah. My daughter-in-law had told me Sarah was in Europe, too busy with her artistic pursuits to check on a dying old man. Another lie to add to the ledger. "Sarah, what are you doing skulking in the dark?" I asked, my grip tightening on the cedar post. "I'm not skulking," she whispered, stepping into a patch of moonlight. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "I've been sleeping in the loft for 2 days. I tried to come to the house, but Evelyn told me you were in a highly reactive state, and that seeing me would trigger a stroke. She threatened to call the sheriff if I stepped on the porch." The first shift in information landed with the weight of a falling mountain. Evelyn hadn't just been isolating me, she had been barricading the ranch against the only person who might actually give a damn about my soul. "She's moving me Monday, Sarah," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "Pinecrest. She's already shredding the will." Sarah didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a photocopy of a land survey. She's not just moving you, Grandpa. She's already signed a preliminary letter of intent with a firm called Verdant Living. They aren't building a retirement community. They're building a copper processing facility. The $5 million appraisal? That was the family price, she told Mark. The real number on this contract is $22 million. The perception shift was instantaneous. I wasn't just being discarded for convenience. I was being liquidated for a fortune that would vanish into offshore accounts before my body was even cold in a nursing home bed. The moral justification Evelyn used, that I was a burden, was merely the mask for a heist. I looked at Sarah, and for the first time in months, I felt the balance of power quiver. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a witness. I need you to get to Billings, I whispered, my fingers digging into her arm. The law firm of Miller and Stone. My old partner, Elias, is still there. He has the original, ironclad, deed, the one my father signed that forbids industrial use of this soil for 99 years. Evelyn thinks she shredded the only copy. She's wrong. Sarah's eyes sharpened. She's watching the driveway. Grandpa, and Mark. Mark just sits there. He looks at her like she's the only thing keeping the world from ending. I looked back at the house. The master bedroom light flickered on. Evelyn was awake. She was likely checking the patient. Go through the creek bed, I commanded, the old authority returning to my voice. Take the old Ford tractor in the south shed. It's loud, but she'll think it's just the wind in the valley. Meet Elias. Tell him the Silver Creek is rising. As Sarah vanished back into the shadows of the barn, I stood alone in the dark. I listened to the low, mournful hoot of a great horned owl in the rafters above, a sound that echoed the emptiness of the betrayal I felt. The light from the house was a pale, sickly yellow against the majestic, unforgiving blue of the Montana night. I felt the weight of the $22 million secret sitting in my chest like a stone. I turned back toward the house, my legs moving with a phantom strength. I had to get back before she found my bed empty. I had to play the part for a few more hours. I had to be the confused old man one last time. But as I reached the porch, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The mudroom door was wide open, and Evelyn was standing there, holding my empty water glass, her silhouette as sharp and cold as a scalpel against the light. Evelyn didn't move. She stood framed in the doorway, the pale yellow light from the mudroom casting a long, distorted shadow that reached my feet. In her hand, the empty water glass caught the moonlight, shining with a cold, medicinal silver. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the scuff of my own labored breathing and the distant, dying moan of the wind. My heart, which had been racing in the barn, suddenly settled into a heavy, rhythmic thrum. It was the calm of a man who had already seen the end of the world. Arthur, she said. Her voice wasn't sharp or accusatory. It was filled with that same, suffocating, concern, a tone so thick with artificial honey it made my skin crawl. What are you doing out here? The air is freezing. You know what the doctor said about your lungs. I slumped my shoulders, letting my jaw hang slightly slack. I allowed the sand to return to my limbs, leaning heavily against the porch railing. I needed her to see the victim she had created, not the man who had just dispatched a messenger to Billings. The horses, I rasped, my voice thin and cracking. I thought I heard the mare. I thought Martha was calling me. The ink from the fountain pen was the color of a deep, bruised violet, almost black against the cream stationery. As I pressed the nib to the paper, the scratchy sound reminded me of the winter of '98. When a blizzard threatened to take half my herd and I had to sign a bank loan that felt like a death warrant. Back then, the ink smelled of hope and desperation. Tonight, it smelled of iron and finality. I wasn't just writing a will, I was designing a labyrinth. My hand, once heavy with Evelyn's chemical cocktails, moved with a fluid, terrifying precision. The adrenaline had stripped away the sand, leaving behind a skeletal strength I didn't know I still possessed. I, Arthur Miller, being of sound mind and under extreme duress. I wrote the words small, tucked into the very bottom of the page, beneath a rambling, senseless paragraph about the lineage of my prize bulls. It was a hidden in plain sight clause. If Evelyn glanced at it, she'd see the incoherent babblings of a fading mind. But to a forensic accountant or a lawyer like Elias, it would be a flare fired into a dark sky. The heavy thud of boots on the porch steps vibrated through the floorboards. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping, the sound of intruders who didn't care if they were heard because they believed the master of the house was already a ghost. I heard the mudroom door creak open. Evelyn's voice, sharp and hushed, met them. "He's in the study. Make it quick. My husband is a light sleeper. And I've told him the transport isn't coming until 8. The first shift in information hit me as I folded the paper. Evelyn wasn't just hiding this from the law, she was hiding the timing from Mark. She needed me gone before my son woke up and had a chance to look me in the eye one last time. She feared his guilt more than she feared my resistance. I didn't hide the paper in a drawer. I stood up, my joints screaming, and walked to the wall where a portrait of my wife Martha hung. Behind the frame was a small, recessed cavity I'd carved out decades ago to hide the ranch's original grazing permits. I slid the new document inside, then turned back to the desk just as the study door swung open. 2 men stood there. They weren't wearing medical scrubs. They wore dark windbreakers and carried a folded gurney that looked more like a tactical tool than a piece of hospital equipment. One was thick-necked with a face like a slab of granite, the other was thin, with eyes that scanned the room like a hawk looking for carrion. "Mr. Miller," the thin one said. His voice was a flat, rehearsed monotone. "We're here to help you get comfortable. It's time to go." I didn't struggle. I didn't yell. I looked at Evelyn, who stood in the shadows behind them. She was holding my wool coat, her face a mask of tragic concern. I felt a sudden, sharp sting in my nostrils, the smell of industrial-grade ammonia coming from the cloth the thick-necked man was subtly palming. They weren't just taking me, they were prepared to silence me if I made a sound. The perception shift was chilling. This wasn't a nursing home transfer. This was an abduction sanctioned by a marriage certificate. "I need my glasses," I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to satisfy their expectations. As I reached toward the desk, I accidentally knocked over the heavy brass lamp. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. Upstairs, I heard the sound of a bed creaking. A door opened. "Evelyn? What was that?" Mark's voice was thick with sleep, drifting down from the landing. The balance of power flickered. The thin man looked at Evelyn, his jaw tightening. Evelyn's composure slipped for a fraction of a second, a hairline fracture in her porcelain mask. "It's nothing, honey," she called out, her voice straining to remain sweet. "Arthur just tripped. The transport arrived early to beat the snow. Go back to sleep. I've got it." "Early?" Mark appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes. He looked down into the study. He saw the 2 men. He saw the gurney. And for the first time, he saw me, not as a patient, but as a man standing in the wreckage of his own home. "Dad?" he asked. There was a note of genuine, raw confusion in his voice. The thin man moved toward me, his hand reaching for my arm. But I stepped back, my spine straightening. The touch of the cold brass poker against my leg, the one I had considered using earlier, reminded me of the weight of my ancestors. I didn't pick it up. I simply pointed at the black folder Evelyn had left on the desk. "Mark," I said, my voice no longer cracked. It was the voice of the man who had built the Silver Creek legacy. "Before I get on that gurney, ask your wife why the letter of intent for this ranch is for $22 million. And why your name isn't on the bank routing instructions." The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the clock on the mantel ticking. A frantic, mechanical heartbeat. Mark's gaze shifted from me to the folder, then to Evelyn. The men in windbreakers tensed, their shadows looming large against the bookshelves. I sat back down in my chair, crossing my legs as if I were hosting a board meeting. I wasn't the one in the cage anymore. They were. The silence in the study was no longer empty, it was pressurized. Like the air inside a storm cellar before the tornado hits. Mark descended the stairs slowly, his bare feet making a soft, vulnerable slap-slap sound against the cold oak. He looked smaller than I remembered. his frame eclipsed by the shadows of the two transporters, who stood like sentinels of a different world. I watched his eyes fix on the black folder. He reached for it with a hesitant hand, his fingers trembling, a trait he inherited from my father. A man who hated confrontation as much as he loved the land. Evelyn? Mark's voice was barely a breath. What is he talking about? 22 million? Evelyn didn't flinch. She stepped toward him, not with panic, but with a fluid, predatory grace. She placed a hand on his chest. Her touch light but controlling. Mark, honey, the stress is making him hallucinate. You know the medications cause confusion. He's seeing numbers that aren't there. The numbers are there, Mark, I said, my voice cutting through her sweetness like a blade. Look at the routing header on the 3rd page. It's not an inheritance account. It's an offshore trust under the name E.V. Sterling. Tell me, Evelyn, does the V stand for the victim you're currently bleeding dry? Or is it just a vestige of your previous identity? The micro shock wasn't just in the name. It was in the reaction of the thin man in the windbreaker. He didn't look surprised by my outburst. He looked at his watch. He wasn't a medical professional or even a simple thug. He was a man on a schedule. A contractor for a high-end liquidation service. And then, I saw the second sign. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black digital jammer. Clicking it on, the tiny red light pulsed like a dying heart. They had prepared for Sarah. They had prepared for a cell phone call that would never go out. Check the folder, Mark, I urged. Mark finally opened it. His eyes raced over the lines. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. But then, the betrayal took a deeper, more perverse turn. As Mark flipped to the signature page, he didn't find a blank space for me. He found his own signature. Or rather, a perfect, digital forgery of it, authorizing the sale. I never signed this. Mark stammered, his voice breaking. Evelyn's hand moved from his chest to his cheek. Her voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You did, Mark, last night, after the 3rd glass of wine. You said you wanted us to be free of this place. You said your father was a weight around our necks. Don't you remember? The shift in power was a sickening vertigo. She wasn't just gaslighting me, she had been drugging my son. 2. She had turned the house into a laboratory of compliant ghosts. Mark looked at his hands as if they didn't belong to him. A man lost in a fog he didn't know was manufactured. The thin man stepped forward. His patience finally evaporated. Enough. The car is idling. Mr. Miller, you're coming with us. Mark, go back upstairs. This is for the best. The thick-necked man moved toward me. The sharp, chemical tang of the ammonia-soaked cloth now unmistakable. It filled the room, a biting, clinical scent that signaled the end of diplomacy. I felt the cold metal of the gurney brush against my leg. My heart hammered, a frantic, ancient drum. I looked at Mark, hoping for a spark, but he was staring at the forged signature. A broken man in the middle of a nightmare. Wait, I said, standing my ground. There's one more thing in that folder. Something you missed, Evelyn. She paused, her eyes narrowing into slits. There's nothing else, Arthur, you're done. The ironclad clause. I lied, my voice steady as a mountain. The one that triggers a criminal investigation if the property is sold to a non-agricultural buyer while the primary owner is still alive. It's in the hidden pocket of the folder. Go on, look. It was a bluff, a gamble born of the violet ink I had used earlier. I needed her to look away from the men. I needed the men to look at the money. As Evelyn snatched the folder from Mark's hands, a sudden, blinding flash of blue light strobed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the sun. It was the high-intensity floodlights of the old Ford tractor, roaring up the lawn, driven by someone who didn't care about the flower beds. The engine's growl was a deafening, mechanical roar that shook the glass panes in their frames. The thin man reached into his jacket, his hand disappearing toward his waistband. The thick-necked man lunged for me. In that split second, I didn't reach for the brass poker. I reached for the light switch. I plunged the study into total, suffocating darkness. The only thing visible was the red pulse of the digital jammer on the floor and the sweeping blue floodlights from outside. cutting through the dark like searchlights in a prison break. I heard a muffled grunt, the sound of a heavy body hitting the mahogany desk, and the frantic, shrill scream of Evelyn, not in fear, but in rage. "Find him, don't let him get to the door." I dropped to my knees, feeling the cold, rough texture of the rug beneath my palms. I wasn't an old man in that moment. I was a fox in a burrow I had dug myself. I crawled toward the corner where the portrait of Martha hung, my fingers searching for the edge of the frame. But as my hand touched the wood, a different hand closed around my ankle, a hand that was cold, small, and terrifyingly strong. "You're not going anywhere, Arthur," Evelyn's voice hissed in the dark, right beside my ear. The cliffhanger remains: who was on the tractor? And what did Evelyn find in the folder that made her stop caring about the pretense of care and start acting like a killer? Evelyn's grip on my ankle was a cold, unrelenting vice, but she had forgotten one thing: this house was built on timber I had hand-selected. And I knew every inch of its resistance. As the blue strobe lights from the tractor outside sliced through the darkness, I felt the vibration of the floorboards, a deep, rhythmic shudder that felt like the heartbeat of the land itself. It was the same vibration I felt when the spring floods used to threaten the valley. A signal that it was time to fight or be swept away. I didn't pull away from her. Instead, I used my free leg to kick backward, catching the heavy brass base of the fallen floor lamp. The metal groaned against the oak, and the smell of scorched dust and ozone from the shorted-out bulb filled the air. It was a sharp, biting scent that signaled the end of the domestic charade. The darkness was broken by a sudden, deafening crash as the mudroom door was taken off its hinges. It wasn't the police. It was Sarah, perched atop the old Ford tractor like a Valkyrie, the machine's steel bucket having punched through the wall of the house with the indifferent force of 30 years of unbridled torque. "Grandpa," she screamed over the roar of the diesel engine. The first shift in information occurred as the thin man in the windbreaker fumbled for his weapon. He wasn't looking at me anymore, he was looking at the woman who had just brought a 3-ton piece of farm equipment into the living room. But Sarah wasn't alone. Jumping down from the fender was Elias, my old partner, clutching a leather briefcase as if it were a shield. He didn't have a gun, he had something far more lethal in a state like Montana. A court-ordered injunction and a digital recorder that had been live-streaming the last 20 minutes of audio to the sheriff's department. "The jammer," the thin man hissed, realizing his red light device was useless against a hardwired recording Elias had planted in my study weeks ago, long before Evelyn thought she had one. The perception shift hit Evelyn hardest. She let go of my ankle, scrambling backward into the light of the tractor's lamps. Her face, usually so porcelain and perfect, was now a distorted mask of feral desperation. She realized that the senile old man hadn't been reacting to her moves, he had been baiting them. The $22 million deal wasn't a secret, it was the anchor I was using to drown her. I stood up, my knees cracking like dry timber. I reached for the wall and flipped the backup circuit breaker I'd installed near the portrait. The study flooded with a harsh, unflattering white light. "The signature in that folder, Evelyn," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who had reclaimed his throne. "Mark didn't sign it, and neither did a computer. You did, and you did it using a signature pad linked to a notary account that Elias flagged as fraudulent 3 years ago." The balance of power didn't just tip, it shattered. The two men in windbreakers exchanged a single, silent look. They weren't paid enough to engage in a standoff with a federal-level fraud investigation looming. They backed toward the broken mudroom wall, disappearing into the swirling snow and the shadows of the pines, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the center of the wreckage. Mark stood on the stairs, his face ghost white. He looked at the shattered wall, the tractor idling in his house, and finally, the woman he had married. He saw the letter of intent, clutched in her hand, the paper she had tried to hide. "Evelyn," he whispered, the sound of a man's heart breaking in real time. "You told me he wanted this. You told me he asked for Pinecrest." Evelyn turned to him, her voice suddenly switching back to that terrifying, saccharine sweetness. "Mark, honey, listen to me. I was doing this for us. For our future. Think of the money. We could leave this dirt behind. We could be whoever we wanted to be. She didn't see the glint of the silver locket hanging from Sarah's neck, the one containing Martha's picture. It was a sensory anchor that reminded everyone in the room what this land actually represented. The air in the room was cold now, the winter wind whistling through the hole in the wall, carrying the bitter, clean scent of pine needles and impending snow. I walked over to my desk and picked up the violet ink document I had hidden behind Martha's portrait. I didn't hand it to Evelyn. I handed it to Elias. "This is the new will," I announced, signed, witnessed by the recording, and authenticated by the fact that I am standing here, perfectly capable of describing every lie told in this room tonight. Elias opened the briefcase and pulled out a second set of papers. "And this," he said, looking directly at Evelyn, "is the audit of the Sterling estate. The widower from 3 years ago? His daughter found the discrepancies. Evelyn, we've been waiting for you to make a move on a property this large. We needed the intent to be undeniable. Tonight, you gave us 22 million reasons to call the FBI." Evelyn didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply sat down in the wingback chair I had just vacated, her fingers tracing the mahogany armrest as if she still owned it. She looked at the hole in the wall, her eyes vacant, a predator who had finally run into a wall she couldn't charm her way through. I stepped onto the porch, looking out at the $5 million ranch, no, the $22 million legacy. The moon was high, casting long, silver shadows across the pastures. The silence of the Montana night had returned, broken only by the cooling tink-tink-tink of the tractor's engine. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my throat, reminding me that I was still alive, still the master of this soil. The sheriff's sirens were a distant wail, miles away, echoing through the canyon, but for now, there was just the wind, the land, and the truth. The red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers finally crested the rise of the north pasture, painting the snow in rhythmic, bruising strokes of color. Inside the study, the silence was heavy, smelling of diesel exhaust from the tractor and the metallic tang of unmasking. Evelyn remained in my wingback chair, her spine rigid. She didn't look like a defeated woman, she looked like a chess player who had realized the board was missing a king. Her eyes were fixed on the shredded remains of my old will, which lay on the rug like white autumn leaves. "The FBI will want the digital notary logs, Evelyn," Elias said, his voice dropping the professional veneer for something harder. "They've been tracking the E.V. Sterling accounts since the widower in Oakhaven fell down his cellar stairs. You weren't just lucky, were you? You were methodical." The micro-shock didn't come from the mention of the dead widower. It came from Mark, as the deputies entered the mudroom, stepping over the debris Sarah had created. My son didn't rush to my side. Instead, I watched him quietly slip a small, familiar object into his pocket, the black digital jammer the thin man had dropped. For a fleeting second, his eyes met mine, not with the remorse of a son, but with the calculated survival instinct of a man wondering if any of the Sterling money had already cleared into an account he shared with his wife. The betrayal wasn't just Evelyn's, it was a contagion that had seeped into the very bloodline I was trying to save. "Mark?" I called out, my voice sounding older than the hills. He didn't answer. He turned to a deputy, his face shifting instantly into a mask of a grieving, confused victim. "She drugged us both," he claimed, pointing at Evelyn. "I didn't know, I swear. I thought we were just helping him." Evelyn finally looked at him. A small, chilling smile touched her lips, the first genuine emotion I'd seen on her face all night. It wasn't love or hate, it was the recognition of a fellow predator. She knew then that Mark was willing to throw her to the wolves to keep the ranch, just as she had been willing to throw me to the clinic to sell it. The deputies led her out. She didn't struggle. She walked through the shattered wall and into the cold Montana night with the same regal posture she had used to serve my tea. As the cruisers pulled away, the silence returned to Silver Creek. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a house that had been gutted while the frame remained standing. Elias stayed behind, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his overcoat. He looked at the hole in the wall, then at the new will sitting on the desk. "It's done, Arthur. The injunction is permanent. The developers are already pulling their letter of intent to avoid the RICO investigation. The ranch is yours, every blade of grass. I walked to the window, watching the tail lights of the police cars disappear into the pines. I felt the rough texture of the violet ink paper still in my pocket. I thought about the words I had written in the dark. I hadn't just protected the land, I had rewritten the rules of the inheritance. Elias, I said, not turning around, the new document, you noticed the clause on page 12? The one about the continuous stewardship requirement? Elias hesitated. I saw it. It's unconventional, Arthur, even for you. Mark believes he's the survivor here. I whispered. He thinks because his signature was forged. He's the innocent party, but the land knows. The land remembers who held the pen and who held the wine glass. I turned back to the room. Sarah was sitting on the floor by the fireplace, her head resting against the stone. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clear. She was the one who had driven the tractor through the wall. She was the one who had slept in the loft. Sarah, I said. She looked up. There's a safe deposit box in the Billings First National. I told her. The key is inside the lining of Martha's old sewing kit. Inside that box isn't a deed or a check. It's a map of the back 40, marked with the locations of the original survey stakes from 1890. I paused, listening to the distant, lonely howl of a coyote, the true owner of the night. The moon was setting, leaving the ranch in a deep, pre-dawn indigo. I need you to go there tomorrow morning. I continued, before the lawyers start their paperwork. Before Mark realizes what the new will actually says about the ownership of the mineral rights. The cliffhanger remains in the question I saw in Elias's eyes. He knew that the $22 million valuation wasn't based on the copper processing plant. He knew what the developers had really found beneath the soil of the back 40, something I had kept secret even from my own wife. I looked at Mark, who was now standing by the wreckage of the mudroom, staring out at the land as if he already owned it. He didn't know that the signature he had forged wasn't the only thing that had been replaced. Arthur, Elias asked, his voice barely audible, if you tell her what's under that oak grove, if you let that secret out, you know the ranch will never be quiet again. Don't you? Is that justice, or is it just a different kind of greed? I didn't answer. I reached for the light switch and turned it off, leaving us all in the gray, uncertain light of a morning that felt like an ending, yet tasted like a beginning I wasn't sure I wanted to see. The morning didn't arrive with a fanfare, it came as a slow, gold-leafed bleeding across the eastern horizon. I stood on the porch, my hands resting on the cedar railing, feeling the cool, damp mist of the mountain air settle on my skin. The scent of charred wood from the struggle was gone, replaced by the earthy, revitalizing smell of wet pine needles and crushed clover. In my hand, I held the small, black digital jammer Mark had tried to salvage. I didn't smash it, I didn't throw it in anger. I simply walked to the edge of the creek and opened my palm, letting it drop into the rushing, icy water. It was a silent, symbolic surrender of the digital ghosts that had haunted my home. Step by step, I moved back into the study. The sun was now high enough to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Elias and Sarah had gone to Billings, leaving me with a final stack of documents to sign, not transfers of power, but a perpetual land trust that would ensure no developer, no copper plant, and no greedy relative could ever scar this soil again. I picked up the fountain pen one last time. As the purple ink met the paper, I felt a physical sensation of weightlessness, as if the very stones of the ranch were no longer pressing against my chest. I wasn't just signing a will, I was restoring a boundary that had been breached by greed. The news reached me 3 days later through a brief, clinical phone call from Elias. Evelyn's previous successes had unraveled like a cheap sweater. The FBI had traced the Sterling accounts through 3 states, finding a trail of optimized estates and silenced elders. She wasn't just going to prison, she was being erased from the professional circles she had so meticulously manipulated. I watched a brief clip of her on the local news. Her face was still calm, still beautiful in its own terrifying way, but the eyes were hollow. She looked like a predator that had finally realized the cage door was locked from the outside. Mark remained in the guest house across the valley, He didn't come to the main house. I saw his silhouette occasionally, standing on his porch, looking toward the ranch with an expression I couldn't quite name. He was free from Evelyn. But he was a prisoner of his own silence. He had chosen to wait for the storm to pass rather than help me fight it. And that was a debt the land would never let him repay. I didn't feel the need to confront him. The silence between us was the only justice left for a son who had almost traded his father's heartbeat for a share of $22 million. I walked down to the old oak grove, the place where Martha's ashes rested. The rhythmic, silver chime of the wind bells hanging from the branches sang a song of return. I sat on the bench, watching a hawk circle the back 40. The secret of what lay beneath the soil, the rare earth minerals that had driven the developers to madness, would remain with me and Sarah. We would protect it, not as a source of wealth, but as a reason to keep the fences high and the gates locked. For the first time in a year, my breath came easily, deep and clean. Justice is a quiet repair of a broken fence, ensuring the wolves stay on the other side. If you were in my position, would you choose to remain silent to maintain a fake peace, or would you speak up to defend your own dignity?